There's a lot of things that factor into capturing great video. There's framing and composition, lighting and audio, your creative vision, and then there's dialing in the right settings. That's what we're going to talk about today. If you're new to the channel, my name's Mike Mandigo and this is Passion Video Productions. On this channel, we talk video production tips, lighting and camera basics, and other tips to help you improve your videos. If that's something that's of interest to you, consider subscribing and hitting that little bell to stay up to date with the latest videos. This video is in response to a comment I received from a subscriber that goes by Rave Brave. The tips and settings we're going to be going over today can be applied to most digital cameras. So grab your camera, a beverage, and let's get to it. There's three main settings that we need to lock in before we can begin capturing great video with our cameras, and we're going to talk about those right after we select our frame rate and dial in our white balance. To capture the best video quality with the highest resolution on my camera, I'm going to be shooting in 4K at 24 frames per second. This will give me the most flexibility when editing on a 1080p timeline. If your camera is unable to shoot in 4K, use the highest resolution available to you. Next, we're going to dial in our white balance by using a gray card or manually dialing it in to avoid color casts in our footage. This will keep our whites looking white and other colors looking correct. I have my white balance dialed in manually at 5200 Kelvin. There's also an option for you to use your camera's auto white balance setting, but it runs the risk of your colors shifting slightly while you're filming. This is why I like to dial mine in manually. Now that we have our frame rate and white balance set, let's talk about the settings that we need to dial in so we can begin capturing great video with our cameras. We're going to use a tool that they call the exposure triangle. This involves manually setting our shutter speed, our ISO, and the aperture of our lens. Let me know in the comments if you've heard about the exposure triangle. It took me a while to grasp the concept of using it on a regular basis. Drop a comment and tell me about your experience. By correctly dialing in the combination of all three of these functions on our camera, we'll be able to capture the best images possible. Do me a favor and slap the like button if this is making sense to you so far. So let's start by adjusting the first point in our exposure triangle, which is going to be the shutter speed. We always want our shutter speed to be double our frame rate, and they call this the 180-degree rule. By having our shutter speed set at double our frame rate, it's going to give us smooth motion blur, as well as keep our video looking proper. For example, if our frame rate is set at 24 frames per second, we're going to want to have our shutter speed set at 1/50th of a second. We do this because there's no setting for 1/48th of a second, so we round up to 1/50th. If your camera has the ability to adjust the shutter degree angle, such as the GH5, then you're going to want to have your shutter degree angle set at 180. Now that we have our shutter speed correct, let's move on to the second point in our exposure triangle and dial in the ISO. Adjusting the ISO level is like adding artificial light into our video. I'm using a micro four thirds camera, so I want to keep my ISO as low as possible to avoid adding noise and artifacts into the image and to get the most dynamic range out of my camera's sensor. The camera that you're using may be able to handle higher levels of ISO without distortion, but nothing can make or break an image better than using the right kind of lighting. I'll be using artificial LED lighting to light the subject, to help shape the image, and as well to help me keep the ISO setting low. Tell me in the comments what camera you're using and how you plan on lighting your videos. After we've dialed in our ISO, we can move on to the third and last point in the exposure triangle, which is selecting the aperture on our lens. Shooting with the higher aperture or f-stop like an f8 or f9 is going to help to keep everything in focus, while shooting with the lower aperture, something like an f2 or an f2.8, will help to create a shallow depth of field and isolate the subject from the background. Keep in mind that the lower the f-stop, the wider the aperture will be and the more light that the lens will let in. This can be useful when filming in low light situations, but it also can become a problem when we're filming outdoors in bright daylight or other situations where the light is extremely bright. To counter brightness while using a low aperture, we're going to need to use what they call a neutral density filter. You can think of an ND filter as like having sunglasses for your lens. It's going to give us more flexibility with controlling the amount of light that hits our sensor, and it's going to help us keep everything in balance with our exposure triangle. I use a variable ND filter from the brand Tiffin that allows me 2 to 8 stops of light control, but you can find many other brands on the market that can do the same thing for you. Although the exposure triangle may seem like a complicated procedure to go through every time we want to film, with repeated practice, it does become easier to master these settings. Keep in mind that the process we just went over isn't set in stone. You're free to film and use your camera however you want. These are some things that I've learned over time that have helped me to manually control my camera and master my camera settings. I encourage you to use this process as a guide, but also to experiment and see what settings work best for you with your camera. That's going to wrap up today's video, guys. Do me a favor, if you've learned something today, slap that little like button and share this with a friend that you think could benefit from this also. Until next time, keep that chin up, hit record, and keep making that content.